for being willing to present their LCA studies on diapers. Pippa is currently she's a director and principal consultant at the Greenhouse, a director of TGH Think Space NPC, and she's going to talk about, she also did a study for UNEP and she's an LCA specialist. And so is Dr. Takunda Chitaka. She did a LCA study on one of our research studies in a rural area and in a developing context. And I think that's why the two studies, I think, will complement each other. And I hope we will have a good discussion afterwards. So, Pippa, over to you, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to present this work that I did with UNEP. And yeah, let's get started. So yeah, as I mentioned, my background's life cycle assessment, but I actually haven't done any first-hand study on nappies. So this work was it's a meta study. Which means that we looked at a big literature review, basically kind of zoned in on and really analysed what was out there in the literature on life cycle assessments, because nappies have been a popular topic for life cycle assessments since the early days of life cycle assessment. So that's a picture of the report, and I've got the link there. So this was actually one, just to give some background and context to the work. It's with United Nations Environment Programme, specifically with the Life Cycle Initiative group within that programme. And it's actually one of a series of studies, meta studies, on single-use plastic products, particularly looking at so it was a directive from UNEA 4 about tasking UNEP with looking at, so we all know single-use plastics are a problem, so what are the alternatives, and what specifically can life cycle assessment tell us about alternatives? Because there is this idea of burden shifting, and what we change to, is it really better, or is it just introducing a host of different problems? So it's really this idea of understanding, addressing the problem of single-use plastics, but looking at what are the alternatives and what are the life cycle impacts of those alternatives. So there's a range of studies, and I've given the link there. They're all up on the website of the Life Cycle Initiative if you want to go and look at them. And this was actually the 6th one in the series. And it reviewed, in the end, we focused on 6 life cycle assessment studies in real depth. And I've got those in the presentation just to give you a flavor of it. But we also, of course, looked at the wider literature, because it is quite a rich area of research, and also trying to draw in aspects that aren't just around life cycle assessment. So we're very focused on life cycle assessment, and our findings are only able to be what's been done in the literature, because it's a meta-analysis. But we did have to be cognizant of the whole sort of socioeconomic context in which nappies sit. So an interesting space, certainly. Just backing up briefly, I've mentioned life cycle assessment a number of times already, and I'm not sure everyone understands or has an understanding of that. So one very quick slide on what is life cycle assessment. So it's a systems analysis tool, an environmental analysis tool, with the idea that you look at the performance of a product in terms of its whole system. So we look more at the function that the product provides. So in this case, it would be, the nappy providing a way for babies to contain their, so yeah. Difficult one to put into words, but I'll show you the functional units of the studies, actually, which makes it more understandable. But the idea is we look at the product system, and we look at everything that goes into delivering that service that product provides. So all the steps are and this little diagram shows it's from the extraction and production of raw materials through to manufacturing, the distribution and the retail, importantly the use of those products. And then we have aspirationally in the circular diagram, so hopefully we have some sort of reuse steps and recycling with materials going back in. Of course, in our current linear economy, it's mostly products go out to disposal, so landfill or incineration. So it's really this idea of looking at the entire life cycle of a product. So for the nappies, it would be for a cloth nappy, it's growing the cotton, it's making that textile, it's selling it. Use really important there, of course, because you're laundering, washing that nappy over its use, drying it, and then eventually when it becomes too tatty to use anymore, maybe it goes into being used as a rag or something, and then ultimately will be disposed. So with the single use, it would be producing the fluff pulp, so that's from forestry, and then a lot of plastics go into nappies. So it would be producing those, the crude oil that went into the polymer. So it's really all going all the way back, and then the actual manufacturing of the nappy, again, the distribution and retail. So that's got a smaller use phase than the single use. It's just, used once and then discarded, mostly, hopefully landfill or incineration, but of course a lot of problem with informal disposal and dumping and that. So that's the idea of life cycle assessment. The second aspect of it is that not only, so we look holistically along the life cycle. The other thing is to look at the consequences of that product system on our health and the health of ecosystems and on the availability of resources. So a product carbon footprint would be one of the things of a life cycle assessment. It would be a single view, a single issue life cycle assessment, but really the idea is to look broadly across all potential impacts that a product system can have. So carbon footprint, water footprint, human health impacts, and impacts on land use, water scarcity, biodiversity. So trying to be much broader and capture all those impacts. Especially important when we're talking about burden shifting between alternatives, is to capture the range of potential impacts and not just make decisions on carbon footprints. So some context of why nappies was included in the single-use plastics meta studies. So why was it one of the products that was looked at? I think probably don't need much of an introduction to why disposable nappies are a problem. I think not always appreciated really, maybe, that they actually have a significant amount of plastic in them. The polymer, that absorbent polymer is plastic, and as is of course a lot of the waterproofing and the lining, although I'd say there is also some renewables in there, the fluff pulp. And they have environmental impacts really across their whole life cycle, so in their production as well as especially in their disposal. And then when we're looking at the reusables, they have impacts especially in their use, also in their production, because cotton is also a high impact material, but then, and as is making textiles, but then especially also their use phase has impacts associated with it when you're washing that nappy. And also just the scale of it. I mean, I think that the quotes there, this was just for the EU alone, where we could get some numbers, but really it's a significant amount of waste. I think another interesting quote in our study is that in Vanuatu, it makes up 30% of the solid waste stream. So it really is significant as a waste. And it's the local authorities that really have to battle with managing this waste product. So looking just briefly at the life cycle studies that we evaluate. So I'm going to just dive in and give you some high level findings, but I thought probably useful just to show the literature that it's based on. So in the end, we narrowed it down. We had criteria, we did a really big search of the web, various search engines to find all life cycle assessment and nappy studies, of which there were quite a few, especially in quite old ones. But we had specific criteria was that we needed it to be something that looked at alternatives. So it couldn't just be on a single, just the impacts of a nappy. We needed it to look at alternatives. It also the study needed to be in sufficient depth that we could really review it. So it needed to be presented in sufficient, with all its methodological stuff underneath there. It needed to be a full life cycle. So we had these criteria on which to select the studies, and we ended up with 6 studies. So 3 looked at single-use and reusable nappies. And we were also trying to get a range of geographies. Actually, that was our other criteria. So here we found there was a recent Brazilian study that specifically looked at different, at the at the disposable nappy versus a reusable nappy, and then looked at different nappy as service ways, so sort of how you could just be owned in your own house, sort of using reusables, or it could be the old, like we might remember from our parents, maybe had services that actually dropped off reusable nappies and took them away again to wash and then brought them back. So they were looking at that, two different models of that, so more as product as a service. And that was set in Brazil, but in an urban context, importantly. And then another one was quite a well-known study done in the UK, probably the nappy study that comes up most when people look at life cycle assessments of nappies. That was done, a previous one in 2005, I think, and this 2008 study is an update of that one, where they just include the more modern folded nappy. So I think the original study just looked at the good old-fashioned terry cloth reusable nappy compared to a single-use nappy. But this one actually looked at those more recent ones where you buy the fully shaped nappy. And the last one was an Australian study, also looked at two different ways of whether you have a nappy service, commercial washing or home washing, and again comparing to a standard. So the green shows the lowest carbon footprint, actually, just to capture one dimension. And it was always the cloth nappy that came out best. Interestingly, there was a conflict between whether it was commercial or home washed. Home washed came out best in Australia, commercially washed came out best in Brazil. And the shaped nappy, the sort of the modern nappy, came out best for the UK. But there's a lot of, I'll go into some of the underneath of that because it's very context driven and scenario driven, those results. But just to give you a snapshot, and then as I was talking about that sort of functional unit, so what is the function of nappy? So most of them took it over about 2.5 years of nappy use for a child. So basically the toilet training of a child was the most common functional unit, and actually very similar for those three studies. They all looked at that. So another three studies that we looked at weren't looking at reusable versus disposable, but rather within the disposable space, comparisons or alternatives within there. So this one study, and these were very European focused, so we couldn't get them. There was no sort of geographical diversity here, very much Europe focused. The first study looked at a sort of a alternative material, so a light weighting of a nappy, and a glueless nappy, so the sort of new design. The next one looked at using bioplastics instead of conventional plastics in the nappy. And then the third one was actually looking more at handling nappies at end of life and looking at a novel recycling process for disposable nappies at end of life. But as I said, so those were the 6 studies that most of these findings that I'm talking about are really derived from. But then we did look at wider literature, and importantly, there were these top 2 kind of review studies, which were really helpful for us, of course. So especially that top one, a lot of the earlier nappy studies were all reviewed already in a very nice review study. So we used that quite a lot. And then there was a big Zero Waste Europe study, which is also not life cycle assessment focused, but they did include a lot of the literature. And then a third study there looked at sort of the evolution of disposables over the years. So that was also a useful resource. And then that last one that I've included in this list as really also things that really informed our findings was as a trial study. We worked a bit with the Nappy Alliance in the study. They're a UK body that particularly around promoting reusable nappies, and they had were involved in a trial in Vanuatu of single-use nappies. Of reusable nappies, because they were considering banning single-use nappies, and they had this trial. And it was interesting because so it wasn't life cycle assessment, but it did bring in some of the important socioeconomic issues and context issues around reusable nappies, which I think Takunda is going to cover a lot in depth from our South African context. But certainly from our life cycle assessments, we're seeing very much the urban context of disposable and reusables, whereas this was nice just to be cognizant of the very different rural contexts. So giving the very high level results of there, sort of key insights would be that for reusable nappies, the highest impacts are in the use phase. So production of the materials is important, but really in all those studies, it's the use, so it's the laundering, because that happens many times. Hopefully, if you're using reusable nappies, you've got a couple of nappies, but they're being washed frequently over their life, and it's that the water use, the energy, specifically the energy use, the heating water, all of that really makes high use phase impacts. But for disposable nappies, the impacts are really around the production of materials. So it's the nappy itself that is causing the impacts, and that's consistent with its single-use nature. So, and in both of those, and in disposables and in reusables, the geographical context of production and the use and the disposal is really important. So specifically, the energy grid mix is important, both in the production impacts, and then especially, as I said, in the use impacts because of energy use in washing, heating water, but especially also in disposal. Geographical context is important, which comes to my fourth point there, is that we find in life cycle assessment, the end-of-life impacts really tend to be underrepresented because most studies, or none of the studies, took into account that there might be inappropriate disposal of nappies. So although it's often talked about in the literature and the challenges, whatever, it's not actually modeled. Generally in the studies, it's sort of the desired end of life. So it's landfill or incineration, especially in Europe, it's incineration with energy recovery. So there, it's very different end of life impact to what would happen if it's dumped or open dumping or burnt informally or whatever at the end of life. So those aren't represented in LCA studies. So the end of life tends to look a lot less important. So the production is the highest by a long way in terms of highest impact stage of the disposable nappy. But with this caution that it could, we are largely missing those end of life impacts where the nappy is not properly in context, where the nappy is not in formal disposal. So that's important to keep in mind, and I think again something that Takunda will touch on a lot in our South African context. So combining those 4 points, then an interesting thing that comes out is that when it comes to reusable nappies, it's really largely around behavior, consumer behavior, that dictates those impacts. So it's how you wash your nappies, it's the temperature you wash your nappies, whether you're using a modern, efficient washing machine and you're fully that machine is fully packed, loaded when you run your wash, or are you washing it in a big tub, or those aspects, and also how often you use that nappy is really what is dictating those impacts. Whereas with the disposables, it's really the manufacturers, it's what nappy you buy, and it's the municipality that you live in more than what you do as a consumer. Maybe you do have some control, although not necessarily, even in our context, whether that nappy is properly disposed of or not. You might not even have an option. So it really is mostly just around the product rather than the consumer behavior. But in both of them, there is that quite strong behavioral element, which is why it becomes a real challenge when we come. And I know this looks like a hugely busy slide, and I've broken it down in some subsequent slides. But this is straight from the report. And what we really wanted to come out with was not just the, oh, well, throw up our hands in despair. It really depends what you do as to whether you can say whether we should be using or whether the single use or the reusable is better. What we try to do is really break it down so that we could say, well, not that it depends, but under this context, this reusable or the single use is preferred. So in this high level one, I know it's probably too small for you to read. I just wanted to kind of show what we did was we broke it down first into the two contexts, the two sets of blocks here. So the first one on the left being what we call the eco or cost conscious consumer. So basically the consumer that's willing to change or make the effort to use reusable nappies. And then on the other side, we have what we've called the indifferent consumer, which I think is quite unfair now looking back at it, or as we moved on with the study. And I think when we've done materials post the report, we've actually changed this, because it's really not only a consumer that might not care about the environment or the cost of disposable nappies, but it often is just your context is not suitable or not conducive to being even able to do to use reusables. And interesting there was from that Vanuatu case study that I mentioned there, when they, so they were giving free reusables, quite nice modern shaped ones, into the villages, and then really asked consumers or the villagers, their experiences. And what came out was they really struggled to dry the nappies in their climate. And, with my South African lens, I was very much thinking it was going to be around water issues or, having water to wash and that. But really for them, it was actually around having and being able to dry those nappies, and I think, I guess anyone in Cape Town in the last few days, I guess, could understand that, you have perhaps this significant challenge at times where you can't just wash and hang up a nappy. It's not going to dry. So I thought that was quite interesting. So it's really, sometimes you just your context isn't suitable for reusable. So that's the second block over there. And then on the rows, what we've looked at, and I'll go into different columns in the next slide, but on the rows, what we broke it down into context was that the waste management context was really important. So we broke it down into the top row, where it's really there was no formal waste management and no recycling, or so it's unsanitary landfill or open dumps, open burning. It's not, if it's managed, it's minimally managed. Whereas in the next row, it's formal waste management. So that would be good sanitary landfill, and especially incineration with energy recovery. So this captured most of the context of the studies, especially in the Europe context, with incineration and energy recovery, or properly managed, formally managed in a sanitary landfill. And then the last row was looking at countries with advanced waste management support. So there were those new disposable diapers that looked at bio-based and recycling of nappies. We called these only suitable in advanced contexts because most countries don't have that infrastructure to have composting of nappies or industrial composting of nappies or anaerobic digestion of nappies, or recycling of nappies yet. Even though the technology is there, it doesn't. It really isn't. It's in very small niche areas. I think there was a case study in Italy where they're doing the recycling, but it's definitely niche. So that's the third, advanced waste management. So zoning in onto the left, so hopefully making it a little bit more readable. And to break it down, so these are what we call those willing to actually to be able to do reusable nappies. And in most contexts, if you have the willing consumer and a context in which you could use reusable nappies are preferred. So my key, I didn't really go through it, but the blue blocks are reusable nappies, preferred, environmentally preferred. The orange ones are single-use nappies, preferred, and then where it's both, the split box means that the LCA studies could go either way. There was no real clear preference for single-use or reusable. So there's a clear preference where consumers are willing to. Especially important is to wash them efficiently. So if you have consumers that are willing to wash efficiently, meaning in the urban contexts of the LCA studies meant washing them below 60 degrees, line drying them and putting them in an efficient modern washing machine and a fully loaded washing machine, then that was generally the most efficient way of washing. Actually an interesting aside also is that it seems that working with the Nappy Alliance, certainly most of those modern shaped nappies don't require the very high temperatures or the long soaking. In fact, they were of the opinion that generally that's bad for the modern absorbent materials. So it's actually not that you have to wash at very high temperatures or do that very boil them or soak them for a long time in bad substances. That's actually the modern, it's quite different from the older terry cloth. So it is possible to wash them in an environmentally friendly manner, and certainly if you do that, then they have lower environmental impacts than disposables. The other really important consumer-driven aspect to having good low impacts of reusable nappies is using them a sufficient number of times. So if you bought a nice, pretty kitty-shaped nappy and you really only use it once or twice, then it's not going to be a good option. But if you're using it many times, especially if you hand it on after your baby or you have a second child or a third child, the more you use them, the lower the environmental impacts when you look at it from a product system. So that's the second column. And then the third one was really appropriate disposal of nappies. So if you don't, interestingly, also in the UK, there's a big problem with people putting nappies in their recycling because the packaging tends to have nice recycle signs on it, even though it probably means the actual plastic package of the nappy is recycling. They're not meaning nappies inside. But apparently there was, as a local council in the UK, there was a study that showed how they really battled to stop people putting their nappies into their recycling streams, which really then just contaminates the whole recycling stream. So it's a big problem. So if you're not doing that, if you're appropriately disposing of your nappy, and you're not flushing them, that's another high impact of nappies. You're not contaminating recyclables and you're not littering them. Then with good waste management, then the disposables actually start to become fairly competitive, especially if they're being washed poorly, or if you have very high carbon electricity, or you're not using your reusables a large number of times. Then the single use start becoming competitive, or as good as in terms of the environmental impacts, especially if you're getting energy recovery from them at end of life. And then same with the advanced nappy, single-use nappies at end of life. If they are being composted at end of life, so the new bio-based ones are actually being composted, or if they're being recycled, then you can start to see a preference for disposable nappies or single-use nappies, but with the proviso. So I don't have in the report, there's asterisks there just to say the proviso is that most of those advanced technologies are demonstration or small-scale pilots, and really the issue is less with the technology, perhaps of the recycling technology which is there, but it's how do you on a big scale collect nappies hygienically, so you get people to separate out their nappies from their waste. Already we can hardly get recyclables separated out from the general waste stream. Now we're going to have to say we must also keep our nappies, and how do you keep them hygienically for collection? So that whole sort of collection system for advanced waste management is really possibly the bigger issue than the actual technologies of composting or making compostable nappies or having recyclable nappies. So that was that block. Looking at the other side, which we call the indifferent consumer, or as I was saying, sort of the context not suitable for reusables, there we had that when there's really inappropriate disposal, so when there's dumping of nappies, we're kind of making the flyer there that really reusables would still be a better option because of the very high end-of-life impacts, even though those weren't well captured in the LCA study. So that's drawing on wider literature. But the other, where nappies aren't washed well, where they're washed at high temperatures, or they tumble dried with lots of electricity use, or if they're only used a few times, then you really see a preference for disposable nappies. And the difference, that first block is undecided there, can go either way, because if you have low carbon electricity, there it is less important, of course. So even if you're washing in a washing machine and tumble drying, if your electricity is from renewables and say your hot water is from a solar geyser, then you're probably still showing a preference for reusables, even though you are washing them inefficiently. But then that would be just the sub case. Generally, they're inefficient washing. There's a preference for single use again. So the did I skip over? No. Okay. So for the UNEP report had very much a focus on policy recommendations. So I've just sort of summarized these quickly. It really just sort of repeats what's in that matrix diagram. But there's sort of this general preference for reusable nappies, but it really is important, if you were going to push them as a policy context, is that you really need to educate consumers on efficient laundering practices. So that's washing at below 60 degrees, it's having efficient modern washing machines, or washing in a tub, not in a small tub. And the other aspect there is, if you're going to, for governments anyway, for policy, if you're going to put policy on trying to transition to reusable nappies, it's really important that you provide the right infrastructure, especially access to water, but also low carbon electricity, because if you have low carbon electricity, then the whole washing becomes not such a big impact, and drying, then you're mitigating that from a different perspective, not putting it all on the consumer, but rather providing the right infrastructure. The other one for consumers is encouraging multiple reuses of nappies. So any reusable product, the important thing is a reusable product is always more durable, heavier, more materials than the single-use version, but because it's designed to be used many times. And if it isn't used many times, it's going to have a higher impact. So really you want to use nappies many times. The other way through that is to promote nappy service business models. So looking at nappy service is another way of ensuring that those nappies really do get used many times. And the final point there was also around, so even though all studies that do costs show that reusable nappies are significantly cheaper, they have that high upfront cost of buying that set of reusable nappies to start. So another policy recommendation is really financing solutions to help carry the upfront costs of reusable nappies. And there are some nice examples of these in various local councils in the UK, where they provide coupons or to start new parents to buy that first, because really it's a cost saving for them in the long run of not having to deal with all that the single-use waste. So we had also studies that looked at single-use nappies, and given the fact that we have contexts that it's really not feasible that we're going to say, well, yeah, we must all just move to reusable nappies, they have better impacts, we must just use them in the correct way. Really, the reality is the single-use disposables are definitely going to always be around in some context, but there's many things that can be done to improve them. So especially important is the appropriate disposal. So ensuring they don't get flushed and dumped, really just landing up in a landfill as a really first measure, preferably in a formal waste management with energy recovery, they can show significantly lower life cycle impacts. The other way is, since the impact of single-use nappies is all around their materials, ideally what you really want, what showed up well in ways to decrease the impacts is just decreasing those materials. So there are a number of studies that have looked at light weighting, and especially just using less materials. So there was that glueless nappy, so just taking out as much material as you can decreases their impacts. The results for bio-based nappies was fairly mixed in terms of life cycle impacts, because there tends to be an amount of impact of burden shifting within bio-based. So carbon footprint was lower for a bio-based nappy, but its ecosystem footprint was quite high because of all the land use and water use in producing biomaterials and producing bioplastics. But especially important is really around whether that bio-based nappy is actually managed as it's designed to be at end of life, which is composted rather than just put in a landfill. Because if it's in a landfill, it's going to have high impact, even higher impact than a plastic nappy, because it degrades more and gives off methane. So, but if it lands up in an industrial composter, then it does have the lower impacts that it's designed to have. So it's very much around providing that infrastructure. So if you're going to promote bio-based nappies, it's really important to also promote, or at the same time provide that infrastructure for collection and actual composting of those bio-based nappies. And similarly, the nappy recycling shows good potential to reduce life cycle impacts, but it's really, is it actually, how do you make it workable in terms of the collection systems, and getting consumers to actually dispose of to recycle their nappies. So even though it's promising from a research point of view, I think there's more research is needed into designing and also just motivating how would you get consumers to take part. There's, I think, a reluctance to that. Yeah, so I think I'm a bit over my 20 minutes, but my key takeaways, really a reusable nappy system, which efficiently uses energy and water, has lower environmental impacts than single-use nappies. And then the other key takeaway really is that you've got lots of leverage and sort of consumer behavior is really strong in those how the impacts of a reusable nappy come out at the end of the day. Whereas if you're a single-use nappy user, there's very little that you can do. It's really the producers and the municipalities that are tasked with trying to get those environmental impacts down. So quite different life cycle stakeholders there that have leverage to reduce the environmental impacts. So thank you. There's the link to the report. So everything I've said and hopefully a lot more is in the report if you want to go and see all the details. Yeah, but I'm looking forward to your questions and the discussion. Thanks.
So thank you, Pippa, very much. I think Takunda will thank you very much. It was very insightful. You could see the comments. And let's do Takunda's, and then I think then people can ask questions to both of you at the same time. So Takunda, over to you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Just trying to unmute and share at the same time. Is that fine?
Yes, we can see. All good, thank you.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Pippa for presenting my presentation today. You did a great job. Now I have nothing to say. But anyway, so like Pippa said, a lot of the answers they could find were in specific demographics and demographics that don't necessarily align with our situation in South Africa. So what we essentially did is we were doing a diaper study in K2C, Crickets Canyon, and we decided, well, let's throw in an LCA in there while we're there. So we did an LCA, which was me, Charlotte, and Renee, who did the majority of the data collection.
Takunda, I think maybe you can, maybe put your camera off. I think let's see if the sound is not very good, but let's see if it improves the sound if your camera is off.
Trying to figure out where do I put my camera off.
Okay, that's fine. Don't worry.
All right, so onto the diaper structure, which wasn't quite mentioned. The important part is the absorbent core, which Pippa mentioned as the fluff and the stuff inside sodium polyacrylate. That actually is the stuff that absorbed your child's excreta, and it actually weighs the most of its percentage composition for your child. But if you look at the plastics, you'd find that the plastics would actually weigh more if you look at it that perspective. So we've got fluff, we have sodium acrylate, propylene, polyethylene, plastics, and adhesives. So these are the main primary raw materials that we get. We got this information from a local manufacturer who's one of the leading diaper manufacturers in South Africa. So the data sources, like I said, the questionnaire is conducted by K2C, conducted by Charlotte and Rennie. We got information from a diaper manufacturer. We got secondary information from literature, and
Okay, Takunda, you are hanging. Sorry, can anybody else hear Takunda? It seems to me there's a problem with the sound. I wonder. I want to say.
Yeah, there's a problem. She has hung over from her side.
Maybe what we can do is maybe she should go out and come in again, and maybe in that time people can ask questions to Pippa while we do that, Takunda.
Okay, I will mute her in the meantime and ask her to do that. Okay, so yeah, carry on, Irini, with Pippa.
Yeah, maybe while we wait for Takunda, maybe we can use the opportunity or the time just for some questions for Pippa.
Sure. Lauren, put her hand up.
Lauren?
Thanks. Thanks, Pippa, for that insightful presentation. And I like the balance between, we cannot just all go reusables, because our position at WWF is let's try and just put reusables everywhere because the environmental performance is better than single use. But I understand that, context is key. And I understood in the Kruger to Canyon project, the lack of water is something to be considered, for laundering the reusables. But I see that Nikki McLeod is also on the line from Matatile, and there's another situation there where there is water available and reusables is a very promising option for communities in that area. But besides the environmental performance, I saw that on one slide, there was a discussion on the local municipality taking responsibility for the end of life. And is there an example of extended producer responsibility for disposable nappies anywhere globally? Because it definitely makes sense that the producers of disposable nappies would need to take responsibility for the end of life because of the impacts, because of the costs to dispose of these single-use nappies in a sound way.
Yeah, I know, totally agree with that. And I don't know of anywhere. I certainly haven't come across anywhere, but certainly and there was a number of the literature was often in the UK context, just showing really how bad practices, for instance, say like putting recycling symbols on the packaging, can really cause chaos for the local municipalities. So even minor things like just getting them to label their products well. One of the, I think I didn't have it in the high level recommendations, but a further recommendation is really even just on disposable packaging is to have clear guidelines of how to dispose of nappies. So, put the feces into the toilet, scrape them clean, but don't flush the actual nappy. You scrape the contents into the toilet, and you throw away that into your general waste stream, not into your recyclable. So even that level is they're requesting. So let alone you're actually taking responsibility for it. So I haven't come across any. Interesting. Vanuatu I found really interesting as a country that was really actually going down the road of saying they were going to ban single-use nappies. So I think that was really interesting. But I'm not sure where that went after their trial wasn't all that successful because of say just context issues and a lot of yeah, sort of just socioeconomic reluctance to move to reusables, which I think is really important and can't be, you know, so from the environmental point, it is nice and clear, and the guidelines could be really just, you know, use them well and they're a better option. But there really is such a large number of socioeconomic aspects to it that really are going to be the decider, I think, in the long run. So that's really where the policy needs to focus. So I guess similar for WWF in terms of how you can engage with consumers.
Yeah, thanks, Pippa. And just to pick up on the education side of things, it's so important that, and perhaps even the producers would need to be responsible for the education of how to use the product and also how to dispose of them properly. We see these lovely adverts on TV about the big disposable nappy brands and happy babies, but there's no information of what to do with the nappy once it comes off the baby. And we're having that problem also in the packaging space. There is some movement and action there with the on-pack recycling labels, but in disposable nappies is a problem. So I agree. Who needs to take responsibility and educate the consumer? Thanks.
Okay. Sorry, Suzanne and Carly, I will give you. We will give you first chance after Takunda's presentation. Let's try and get back to Takunda, and then we get back to the questions.
Okay, sorry about that. My system kicked me out for some reason. Are we all good, Rennie?
Yes, we're good. We can see.
All right, so the system boundary is what we actually modeled. We looked at the diaper production, so your raw materials, diaper components, and diaper manufacturer, and then the end of life. So the end of life was very unique to the rural areas than it would be to the urban areas. They have different ways of disposing of their diapers. We didn't touch on distribution and use because people, one, use their diapers for different lengths of time. So you'd find that someone will use 3 diapers a day and the other person will use 12 somehow. And as well as people go to get their diapers in different places. So some might go to a sponsor shop, some might go to ShopRite, and how they get there is very variable. So we had to do a waste scenario, which Pippa mentioned that they had very specific waste scenarios that excluded things that might happen. So we had an open dump, but our open dump was, generally dumping in the fields, dumping in the river, dumping in the river bed. So our open dumping was very inclusive of all the different places that people can dump. And it turns out that people have bins, but they put stuff in the bins, so they'll trash, their rubbish in the bin. But this is because they pay someone to come and later dump the contents of the bin. So it's not really a municipal service; it's a dumping tool, if you put it that way. We had unsanitary landfills, so they actually have skip bins that some people use, and then that goes to landfill. Some people burn their waste, and for other, we had pit latrines. People put them down pit latrines, and other which wasn't mentioned. So what I love with CIMA Pro can give you numbers. It can tell you, X amount of CO2 equivalent. But if you're not comparing it to anything, it's a meaningless number. So I like this graph because this graph will tell you which part of your life cycle contributes the most. So the darker green is diaper production, then lighter green is transport, and then the orange is waste scenario. And like Pippa said, your production contributes the most to your results. So you'd find that the darker green is the majority in all of them. But then there's a difference when it comes to human carcinogenic impact. That's mostly waste scenario. And marine ecotox and freshwater ecotoxicity, that's mostly your waste scenario. So it makes you think, why are those so different in comparison to the other bars? So just to give, we looked at all the bars, we looked at all the results, and we're looking at broken down what are the top contributors to diaper manufacturer. And obviously our local electricity is fossil fuel based. It's not good for anyone when we have local electricity. Sodium polyacrylate and fluff, the absorbent core, contribute a lot when it comes to production. But that's an issue where they have to rethink, the materials that they put in their core and how much. So love normalization. Normalization puts your impact relative to the impacts globally. So it can tell you, well, if you do X, it's going to contribute 5% to your global CO2 emissions. So if we look back now, what are we saying? We're saying the human carcinogenic impact, the marine ecotox, the freshwater ecotox. Those are the same bars that showed up before when we were looking at this graph. So the orange actually have the most insignificant impacts. So that means there's something wrong with our waste scenario. So let's just go back and think about the types of nappies that they use in that area. 99% disposables. We've got 1% who use both. So like maybe when they're traveling, they'd rather use disposable because it's easier than to have to sit with the wet nappy. And then only 3 people out of over 1,500 used reusables. So that's a curiosity. So we think, okay, did they ever think about what their preferences is in disposables? So we gave them 3 options to highlight their top 3 preferences. So your dark blue is the primary preference, your orange is the second choice, your gray is the third choice. So if you don't have blue, you'll use orange. If you don't have orange, you'll use gray. And you can see that that blue is popping up quite a lot. I mean, the highest blue is throwing in the bush or the felt, or burning it, or burying it, or skipping. So you can see that people's preferences tend towards improper disposal. But do people even want reusable nappies? And we actually found 18% saying yes, they want reusable nappies, which is quite a curiosity because when we asked them, do you have water for these reusable nappies? Only 37% of all the respondents said that they have daily water access. So as much as we might want to say, oh, reusables are so great, like Pippa said, they don't have water access. So how is it going to work practically if you give someone a reusable diaper and they have nothing to wash it with? And then we asked them why. And it was very interesting. They're convenient. I don't have to wash them because obviously I don't have water. They're more comfortable. They're more affordable. And it's the modern fashion because we have to keep up with the Jones. People did prefer to use cloth, those who preferred. They save me money, they can be reused, they don't cause skin rash. And as well as the previous one, it's comfortable for my kids. So the comfort level seems to be important to these ladies, but both of them report comfort. So when I think about it, like Pippa said, LCA really can't capture, the impacts of improper disposal, even though I model the impact of improper disposal using a Doku, it doesn't quite catch all of the impacts. So I can't model how to carry pathogens and diseases into SEMA-Pro. It won't work. Your diapers which are spread by the dogs, your kids which are walking around in the same area the diaper was spread by the dogs, then the risk of ingestion by your cattle, contaminating of rivers, people dump next to rivers, or when it's the dry season, they'll dump in the riverbed. And in groundwater, they're digging pit latrines, and the pathogens will leach out into the soil and may contaminate the groundwater source. So in conclusion, our electricity is a problem. And a problem every time we do an LCA. The absorbent core, we need to think about, should we reduce the material? So some people have looked at the ratio of SAP and fluff, or do we substitute it altogether to find something else? At the end of the day, we do need to look at the broader impact. You can't just do an LCA and say, okay, I'm done. That's not, an LCA has limitations, and you have to recognize those limitations and take heed of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Takunda. Cherise, back to you. And I think Carly must ask her first question. She's hanging on there for some time. Thank you, Cherise. Thank you very much, Takunda.
Great, yeah, thank you so much. Both presentations were very insightful. Thank you. And I think there's a lot of discussion. There's quite a few questions in the chat we'll get to. But yes, Carly, you have been waiting patiently for a long time. Please go ahead and ask a question. Thank you.
Carly, you are muted.
Oh, that's a video off, but not the mute. Hi. I'm Carly. I am the founder of Mama Toto Cloth Diapers in Nairobi, Kenya. So I think the LCA study, which came out in 2021, was very useful in terms of backing up our entire business model, which is to provide an industrial laundry service with home pickup and delivery and convenient kiosk pickup points at childcare centers in our lower income areas. So it was really great to have the information. But what I think I found, which I think Takunda is starting to get at, is that the LCA study and so much of the information is it's very developed country focused. And I think we're finally starting this discussion about what this looks like in Africa. You know, how majority of stuff never even makes it to a landfill, because all the studies reference landfills and things like that. And I always have to push back and say it never makes it to a landfill, okay, in majority of these places. So I appreciate Takunda like breaking that down. And I think in people talking about extended producer responsibility, that's not going to happen in majority of places. Maybe South Africa, but the rest of Africa, that's not going to happen. None of it's produced there. There's nobody to hold responsible for that sort of thing necessarily. So my question here is basically, what is the next step in these studies to help give us the information to arm us when we are talking to donors and funders and investors for how we go about explaining this issue and these problems? Because they're all kind of like, oh, well, recycling diapers is going to happen, so why would we go back to reusable cloth, is what a lot of investors and people say to me. But I'm like, Kenya and the rest of Africa is so far away from that ability to do that. So are we going to get more studies? What can we get to help back us up in Africa and to make our argument stronger?
Yeah, well said. Great, really great observations. I mean, I agree 100%, and I think I agree so much that I think the study done by UWC and Takunda was so necessary, because to show, I mean, as going to show that high toxicity impact is really from the burning of nappies. So what is being missed in the urban context, in the Global North studies, and even in the one we had from Brazil, they don't take account poor management. So I think that informal burning, at least including that, was a real great step forward, and really interesting to see how much it did show up in results. Yeah, unfortunately, no next steps I think from talking, and I'm not a unit person, just a contractor, but talking from their perspective, I think they're very invested in pushing the reusable side of things, just from all of those sort of at a higher level from the single-use plastic studies. It's what comes through most clearly of all is that it's not the product, it's not the materials, it's the single-use nature that's the problem. And so that holds true for just about all of the products assessed. So yes, there are ways of improving the single-use products, I say with better disposal, but really at the end of the day, it's the fact that they're single-use is actually the issue. And we really need to work towards, more circular solutions. So I think from their side, they're certainly very invested in advancing the reusable agenda. And I think they are cognizant of the fact that it's needed not only in the urban context. And I think, they're working with the Nappy Alliance, who are then also, even though they're a UK organization, very working with Vanuatu, because I think they're also really interested in, as you are, to see it not just in their urban context, but how it works in a rural context. And I think they're, in the rural contexts, or the developing country context, that's where the underrepresented disposal impacts are at their highest. So if anything, there's a stronger case for reusables in those contexts, and it's stronger than being pushed. So already reusables comes out as the better alternative when used appropriately or correctly. It's even stronger argument in non-urban contexts. But I think we do indeed need more studies to show that. But how you get around the lack of infrastructure and to convince is really a sort of a policy issue, I think, more than an LCA one, unfortunately, than not my expertise.
Yeah, and it definitely was heavy on everybody owning a washing machine, whereas
absolutely.
you're looking at 2, maybe 3% of the population owns a washing machine.
Yeah,
so a lot of it's very hard to apply.
But I think the thing is just efficient washing. So whether you wash in a tub, making sure that you have a pile of nappies and you wash them all at once, so that it's basically around minimizing resource use. So you want to minimize your water. So wash efficiently. Don't wash each nappy separately, but you rather want to wash a bunch in a tub. And generally,
spend a lot of time making washing instructions for people.
That actually I also didn't say, but I think what came through very strongly with the Nappy Alliance was that modern nappies are different to old terry cloth nappies, and really what you need to do is follow the manufacturer's recommendations. And there was a nice comment in the chat there about how reusable suppliers tend to be better at consumer awareness, and I think there is good instructions and good support around those reusable products. As you say, maybe less so than the disposable. The single-use people who try and ignore the fact that you have to throw away their product at the end of life and that it's a big problem, they don't go there. Whereas I think the reusable ones really do mostly provide good consumer advice. So it is around making sure that is done and that consumers know to follow that. But I'm sure your products are similar, because it's extending their life and using them correctly is so important.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Carla. Really interesting discussion. I think it's very valid, the difference between different countries, obviously, and different urban and rural contexts. So that's very valuable comments. Thank you. Pippa, just before we go on, there was a comment made right in the beginning by Mario Williams. I don't know if you saw that, in terms of the polyacrylate based superabsorbent not actually meeting the requirements of plastic. I don't know if you want to just address that quickly before we go on to a question in the line.
I don't know that, but then I think that's just me being lazy and calling anything sort of fossil-based polymer as a plastic. It makes no difference from the LCA modeling point of view. So we would model it, or in the studies, they model the production of that sap. So what it's termed is possibly less. But if I'm being lazy in my terminology, I apologize.
Thank you, Pippa. Suzanne, you're up next. Please feel free to put your camera on or just ask a question too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now you can see me as well. Pippa, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have put down a comment in the chat as well, saying that I would really like to see a LCA being undertaken on the new development on reusable nappies. Simply because we've got a new addition to the family, and I've been educated around what you find in the reusable nappies nowadays, and it's jaw-dropping. They sell it to the new parents as you can save 12,000 Rand over the period that your baby will be using a nappy for your first child if you go for the reusables. But what is quite disturbing to me is the fact that they've got about 6 different inner layers that you can add to these nappies, and 3 of those are bamboo based, which probably means that it will be imported and not locally manufactured. And then the other options that they have certainly also have different environmental impacts depending on how the hemp is grown or where the fennel is coming from or where the cotton is coming from. So I would really be interested to see a study being undertaken on the new reusable nappies that's on the market in South Africa to determine what options are really the best in the South African context. Because they've now complicated what used to be a cloth nappy versus a single-use nappy to something that is a combination of many different things, which really complicates the decisions around environmental sustainability as well. Thank you.
Yeah, interesting. As I say, I think we need studies, as you say, in context and just globally, there aren't actually all that many, so interesting. There was a recent Brazilian study, but most of the bigger nappy LCAs are fairly old, although actually that UK study has been recently redone, unfortunately, post our meta-analysis, actually. There's an update, a third update of that. So interesting, that they're seeing the need to keep that current, as you say, because the reusable products are similarly changing all the time. And also what I didn't get into here is there's also hybrid ones where you have sort of a disposable insert, and that part's you dispose and then you use the shell again and again. So they're even, there's fully reusable and there's partly sort of a hybrid, partly reusable. So a lot of different options. And yeah, it would be very interesting to see more studies.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. I also want to just go back to the chat box. Eric had also put a comment in, which I think is relevant to this, that thank you, Pippa, very interesting comparison of the pros and cons of reusable versus disposable, especially in South African context. I'd be interested to learn more about the potential recycling technologies tested. And I think that's also what you're saying, there's very little research in terms of testing these different technologies and products and ideas and on the ground. But I don't suppose if you have any more information on if there are studies being conducted or knowing studies that are currently being investigated that you could probably add to comment on Eric's comments.
Only, I could only refer to what's in our reference list of the study. I haven't read further than that. So yeah, it is a fairly, I think the technology is fairly well established as sort of an autoclaving, and they separate it out and you burn off the renewable. It's quite high energy though. So again, it would be more effective in certain contexts than others. So, always here in South Africa with our very carbon intensive electricity, any process that uses quite a lot of electricity won't look as good as a process that's perhaps, I think it was Italy was the case study. So your grid mix there will also be quite important because of the energy involved, quite high temperatures, as you can imagine. For a hygiene point of view, you do need to run fairly high temperature recycling process. But I don't know enough about it. But yeah, there's references certainly in that I could share on that. And there's various other ones, I think, pyrolysis kind of process. So I think there was a review paper that I could look up, a review article looking at different technologies. But I still think that paper, what struck me most is that even though there's quite a lot of research groups that have done these sort of nice pilot technologies, really the disconnect is, well, you have this really disparate waste source. It's difficult. People don't want to hang on to it. You want to get that out of your house as soon as possible. You don't want to bin it, and how do you store it hygienically until somebody can come and collect it and take it off in sufficient volumes to make such technologies cost effective. So I think that's almost for me where the research needs to be, not just on the actual technologies, which seem to be fairly well demonstrated, at least on pilot scale.
Yes, thanks so much. Yeah, I think that's also certainly from what I've seen as well, a lot of the technologies are site-based when you actually need them to be within the municipal systems in a way to be able to process them so that, you don't have to hold on to it, but, they're processed on a larger scale. So yeah, but thank you. If you could share that link, perhaps after this I can share it with all attendants, but that would be great. Hugh, you're up next, please. Please come online and ask your question. Thanks.
Hi, yes, thanks very much, Pippa and Takunda. Yeah, I'm contracting to Kimberly-Clark with the team, and we are doing the difficult part of piloting collection in a low-income community. So, I'm using behavioral science, social marketing technologies, as well as supportive infrastructure provision and some rewards to encourage it, and working directly with ECDs. We've decided to have ECDs as our kind of support. So there's an institutional center to our pilot. And just going across to, so we're about to launch the first phase in a couple of weeks. Just to go to about the arguments for starting to prioritize proper waste disposal of disposable diapers. The health aspect. What is it? I've been trying to get to the health aspects or the ill health aspects of improper disposal, because the transfer of pathogens between improper disposal and childhood sickness and diarrhea should be very, very well used as to encourage municipalities to start taking better responsibility. But it appears that the material falls between solid waste, community health, and water and sanitation, and they don't really talk to each other. So it's a very difficult issue. Also, the accumulated waste is a big issue for municipalities. What do they do with it? How do they do it? Whose is it? So yeah, that's what we're dealing with at the moment, and our pilot runs until the end of December. So we'll be able to share some interesting approaches to this whole thing. And yeah.
Fantastic. That's super great to hear. Yeah, I really look forward to hearing the results of the pilot. But yeah, it's really nice to move it from the theoretical into the actual practical. So I really look forward to hearing about that.
Sure, thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Hugh. Monique had a really good comments. I don't know if you saw that one, but 100% greenwashing is a big problem. There are many consumers who are keen and interested but get misguided. Increase in biodegradable products in South Africa, for example, but these items still go into the general bin. The correct system is as important as the correct product. And there's quite a lot of comments on consumer from Nikki, awareness and choice and practice and behavior, which supports quite a lot of your presentation that you had earlier, when if you want to target in terms of waste disposal and use, that is a consumer prioritization in terms of their behavior and choice. So a lot of support for that. But I don't know if you want to add anything about the greenwashing from manufacturers, I suppose. I think there's probably quite a lot of people can discuss around that in terms of what is really green and what is really biodegradable, what real impacts are behind those from different mainstream manufacturers and producers.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the biggest issue really is the bio-based is very consuming and sort of confusing to consumers, I think. It's really not appreciated that generally a bio-based plastic that lands up in a landfill has a higher impact than a fossil-based plastic. It just does, it's not a green product unless it's handled correctly in the way that it was designed to do, which is to be composted or digested or whatever. So I think there's big greenwashing in talking about bio products, bio-based, bioplastics, all of that. Green plastics, green nappies. I think it's very easy to charge more to a consumer to make yourself feel a little bit better, because which parent doesn't feel slightly bad about the numbers of disposables that they get through. So I think, yeah, they're an easy target. Many consumers are maybe falling for that, yeah.
I suppose before we go into the next question from the audience, I just wanted to add on to Belinda's, because I think it links on with that. Are there any standards for manufacturing or advertising, just adding on the advertising and marketing of disposables in South Africa?
Sure. Fred, that's really not my area. Yeah, I wouldn't know. I don't know if anyone would know.
Are there anyone in the group that does know whether there are standards for manufacturing of disposables? I mean, there would be SABS approved standards and
Yeah, there must
other
be
related
safety,
things,
yeah.
standard sort of things. But in terms of energy, 30-30 targets, climate change targets, all the rest of it, so I wonder if there are. I'm not aware of any, but I don't know if Prof. Rini, if you've got any ideas on that, information on that. Sorry, I'm just going to, before we move on, because it's quite an important one. So.
No, I was looking if Mario is still in the group. Sort of Mario was on the group, but he's from Kimberley-Clark, so I hope that he would have been able to answer that for us, but he's not here, so no, I'm not aware. Maybe everybody else.
Is he still here?
Sorry, Takunda, did you want to respond to the standards?
I'm looking for Suzanne because they were at some stage working on standards for biodegradability, I believe.
Suzanne is there. Suzanne, I don't know if you want to respond. Otherwise, yeah, I think I'll try and have a look up for those standards and share them with the group if there are any following this webinar. So, but yeah, thanks very much. It's an important question because I mean, if you want to affect change within the production and distribution and manufacturing, I mean, that would be really to look at those standards would be a good starting point as well next to policy development.
If I may come in here, it's my understanding that the standards for biodegradability is still under development between the CSIR and the national standards body in South Africa. I'm not aware that it has been finalized yet, but I can check and let you know. Thanks.
Yes, I think the standards on biodegradability is one, but then also the inputs and raw material use within manufacturing of disposable nappies then would be another. But it would be great. I'll have a look. If I can't find anything, I will let you know. But it will, yeah, I will try and see if we can share something with the group. Nikki, so you've been waiting patiently. Sorry, I am trying to make sure that we cover comments as well as people that are willing to chat and ask questions online. So I hope thanks for being patient.
No, thank you guys, and thanks to Pippa and Takunda. That was fascinating stuff, particularly for our context where we're trying to, I mean, we all know this is a huge challenge, but we're trying to be practical around what can work for rural areas particularly. We live in an area in the mountains where we have 27 rural wards and 1 municipal landfill removal truck. So it's just this overwhelming challenge for rural people. And we've done a little bit of research, and most people really are concerned about disposal of the single-use nappies. We think people don't care, but they really are concerned. And one of their concerns is because they're filling up their backyards as their own private landfills. The burden for disposal sits on them when there's no municipal service. And we've found, I was really interested to hear about your energy grid mix and how that has such a huge influence on the impact of reusables versus single-use plastics, and how consumer behavior can so strongly influence the degree of impact that these choices have. People don't even have indoor plumbing, let alone washing machines in these rural areas. Most people have to walk and fetch buckets from communal taps. And what we're finding is that there is an increase in desire to move towards reusables by meeting some of the other socioeconomic needs, like access to potable water, and how important that understanding that blend of socioeconomic situation is in solving these problems. And I think Lauren made a good point in saying, we can't just say single use is better than reusable. There's so many variables to the context that we're working in. And I think it's such an important premise. And just reading some of Hugh and Rini's recent work and Samora Michelle settlement in Cape Town is so insightful. There's so much more work that needs to be done. And my long story short is that we would really, we're just an implementing NGO, but we would really invite any researchers who would be interested and willing to come and use us as guinea pigs, in a sense. There's a better way of putting it, but there is still so much to learn, and it is so geographically contextualized. And I think we'd be doing ourselves a disservice to say one is better than the other. But the variables, and I love the way that at the beginning of your talk, Pippa, you gave in a sense, the metrics that you'd looked at. So it qualifies in a way what is more suitable for a different landscape and a different socioeconomic context. So I just wanted to say thank you and invite anyone who would like to participate in some real life active studies, because we're finding that consumer awareness has huge influence. And I was interested to hear what Hugh was saying around behavior science and consumer awareness. So vital. So it's really just a comment and an invitation and a quick question. I did post it, but I don't know whether it's been explored. Maybe there's some aspirant PhD bio students out there who could look at the use of alien plant biomass as potential fibers. There's the bamboo concern. Obviously, everything has pros and cons, but we have so much alien biomass in this country, and maybe there's a possibility there of using it as fiber. So thank you very much, and thanks to Rini and Charisse for arranging this. It's been so insightful.
Great, thanks, Nikki. Just very quickly in terms of the biomass question. I didn't come across a study for nappies, but the next meta-study along in the series was on menstrual products. And there is an Indian study that does exactly that. So you looks at a problem, I can't remember what plant it is, but in their local context, and they make disposable menstrual pads out of it. And that was quite an interesting case study. Off the top of my head, it actually was a problem competing with the cheap imports. So I think that was also associated. They did a whole life cycle costing as well as just the environmental. So that's possibly an interesting one. I could send you the reference to the study, but that was sort of interesting that it's been done in an Indian context, but it would be similar. And I think there are things like I can't think of any of the other fibers would possibly be really good alternatives. So it has been done, but I think it's just getting those small NGO kind of size things to compete with the really big brands that have the muscle is really difficult. I think glossed over in today's
question.
Yeah, sure. Sorry,
this is Carly West from
Hi.
Kenya. Yes, so the menstrual hygiene products, we've been talking quite a lot with them for disposable liners. And so in Kenya, they're using banana fibers and pineapple fibers. And India is similar, doing a lot of banana fibers also. So India is definitely your main place where they're using compostable, biodegradable materials for menstrual hygiene products. But I think that's definitely the route we need to go in terms of reusable nappies if we're going to expand into some sort of other fibers like that, is looking at the menstrual hygiene industry and what they're doing. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very helpful. Thanks. Yeah, no, I think it is. It's interesting that it has got more of a hold there. But really, in terms of the materials, initially when we did the meta study, we actually had these two together because you can talk absorbent hygiene products, which is they're so similar in their actual compositions, but then it just made sense because the issues are quite different. We split them into two meta studies, not one single absorbent hygiene products meta group. But yeah, I think really worth learning from each other because there's lots of crossover there.
Thank you very much. I think that also fits in quite nice with quite a lot of comments that are on the chat box that, again, in greenwashing and then manufacturing and production and sourcing of, where the source of raw materials are actually coming from and the impact it has on the life cycle assessment for nappies. So if you are importing bamboo, for instance, that is assumed green but is coming from China, for example, and then imported to manufacture in South Africa or bring into South Africa, then that impact of nappies on the environment is obviously much higher. But if it's local products like alien plants suggested by Nikki, for example, would have a lower impact. So again, I also think that it comes down to affecting policy and putting standards in place for responsible manufacturing and production with nappies to ensure that local products are used, that imports are not brought in, or to ensure that competitiveness in terms of the economies, that you could produce at a more cost affordable for the local community. So I think that's really important discussions of how we can affect policy and implement standards around that. So thanks for that. And the next person in line has also been waiting for a while. Now, Hugh, you're back again. So please feel free to come in and ask a question.
Can we ask Fiona to go first, please? Because she's had her hand up since the very beginning.
Sorry?
Fiona.
Fiona.
Had her hand up from the very beginning.
Sorry, Fiona, it was okay. You were on number 2 on the list, but Hugh, sorry if you don't mind then waiting. Fiona, if you want to take the floor.
If you don't mind, thanks, Hugh. If you don't a question that's a little bit more data and other environmental monitoring work highlights the need for the LCAs to really include the end of life and proper disposal of single-use diapers. But Pippa, you highlighted that this is a gap within the LCA studies. So practically, what can be done to support the end of life part of these studies if it's, if there is improper disposal? I see Takunda's percentage breakdown of how the diapers are disposed of as a key part of this, and this is a question for either presenter, what other data would you then need to complete those LCA studies for diapers to include a proper end-of-life study where improper disposal occurs? And then while you think about that for 2 minutes, I just wanted to add in that there are some pineapple fiber nappies and menstrual products currently being made in South Africa from pineapple cores, the outer bit of pineapples, that's within the Eastern Cape. And there is some bamboo commercial plants, farms within South Africa as well, though the size of them at this stage is not as great as the import size.
Interesting. Takunda, do you want to take this one?
Well, firstly, on my side, I was lucky because we already were doing a study on diaper usage, so I managed to get the information on diaper usage and how, what diapers they use, how many times they use them, how they dispose them. So we managed to get that information from that study. But you can try and say you're doing it in Kenya, but then how do you know what the disposal rate is and how it decomposes is a big one, because if you don't know how it decomposes, SEMAPRO and all these other databases don't necessarily look towards what Africa's problems are. And that might be a uniquely African problem to have the decomposition of this material.
Yes, I agree. It's a two-part problem really, and I think LCA is missing both parts. So as I think Takunda study was fantastically because it actually quantified that, whereas mostly that's just not known. So it's the same as littering though. In any single-use plastic study, say the grocery bags or whatever, most studies don't include littering, mainly just because we don't have a good handle on the quantity of litter. And again, Takunda would probably be most qualified to talk about this, especially after you've got your PhD behind you as well. But I think that's really a big gap. So it's partly in just the actual, what fraction doesn't land up in the landfill, what fraction, and even within South Africa, it's so complicated because it's like what fraction lands up in a well-managed landfill, what fraction lands up in a kind of what we could call an open dump, so it's contained, but it doesn't have a lining and it doesn't have, certainly doesn't have gas capture or anything that a European landfill would have. And then how much is like those open dumps often burn? So how much is it just open burnt? So when you try and model end of life, just getting the actual destinations is a real challenge in LCA. And that's just the first problem. Then the second problem is, so what are the impacts? What leaches out? What gaseous, what when it degrades, what gas comes off? And their models, nice models, are mostly done for European nicely managed landfalls. So only really recently, within the last couple of years, did we start seeing open dump models, which was fantastic. Addition to the sort of the life cycle data modeling world, where we got not just perfectly managed Swiss landfalls with landfill gas capture, which completely don't represent South Africa. We started to see, at least we've got open dumps and we've got open burning that we could throw in, but no one yet has a model of anything, let alone a nappy, just a plastic bottle lying in the veldt. What are the impacts there? That's just not there. And a really big gap is also the marine plastics. So what is the impact of that plastic bottle degrading in the sea? We all know of the issue of microplastics, so we talk about it, but we don't actually have the models that quantify the impact of microplastics on biodiversity. Sort of, it's a macro issue with entanglement, it's a micro issue with toxins. There's so many aspects to it, and there are new methods and a lot of research going into this. There's the it's called the Marilka Marine LCA is a research project that's just starting to put out new models and methods about capturing those impacts. But even so, it's they've managed one small aspect of microplastic ingestion. There's a method, but that doesn't take all the other various pathways that there's impact. So it's just really science catching up, I think, with actually modeling these things. Yeah, thanks, Katrina, putting a link to Marilka.
Great, thanks. Prof. Rini, you had your hand up and it's down again. Do you want to ask a question, make comments?
No, I'll give you first a chance and then I'll probably ask after him.
You?
Yeah, no, hi. My hand was up. But it should have been down. But I just wanted to say that, and to switch over to the it's about the greenwashing. The Advertising Standards Authority does have a particular appendix. I think it's Appendix G, which does provide a very positive information on how to respond to possible greenwashing about nappies and that. So I would, I think it's ASA or it's just Advertising Standards Association. Look for Appendix G and you'll see all the sort of things that you can do. You can also obviously go to the shop owner who sells these things, which I did, and raise their awareness that they are in danger of being sort of accused of greenwashing themselves. So there are lots of ways to address that.
Great, thanks, Hugh. Yes, I think, naming and shaming is also a way to go. But yeah, it's, also if there's a way to report greenwashing, if there is a standard, I think that would be very valuable to familiarize ourselves with being in the industry. Prof. Rini?
I think what was interesting in the study that came out, I'm now referring to the study that you and I did and the one in K2C and another study we did. I read it this week again. I was just wondering what happened to the cloth nappy producers, because as if they have backed down, because I would really like to know, do they still advertise? Do they still do that? Because in many of the areas where we did the research, some said, we don't even know if you can get it in the shops, as if they're not aware that it still exists. Some said we would like to have it because we can use it, but it's as if the cloth nappies disappeared from the scene. Maybe they make it and maybe you can find it in Clicks or somewhere if you really need it, but they disappeared from the scene. I don't know if it's such a big wave, the disposable diapers, that they've decided, okay, let's just make it for being there. So I don't know if Pippa or Takunda want to respond to that, but it's just a comment from our research that the people were not even aware that it still exists.
Yeah, I think if I could just anecdotally comment there, more from the menstrual product side of point of view, and again, because we were doing the literature stuff, it's very Europe focused, but I think one of the recommendations there also was that people, again, very similar results to this. It's the reusable comes out really preferable to the single-use menstrual products, but most consumers have no idea that there is even an alternative. And there is, I'm trying to think of the people that do it. Can't think now, slipped my mind. But I know one of their big policy actions that they're pushing for is that there must be equal shelf space for reusables and disposables in shops, because and that they want sort of from a government policy point of view, EU policy point of view, because it's really difficult to break through into the market for these reusable products, which are mostly smaller and we don't have anywhere near the size of the disposable companies. So I thought that was an interesting, that's an equal problem everywhere in the world, just not knowing that these alternatives are out there.
On the
Great.
flip side,
Sorry, Takunda, yeah.
there are more menstrual products on the shelves lately, the alternatives. So there's one bright side.
Good. Yeah, as it also struck me, I think there was a very nice article not too long ago, also on the main, it was on Nappies, on the Daily Maverick, but it struck me that, you know, most of the sellers, and I think Carly, maybe you could comment here as well, they're mostly online, so they're fantastic options that you can get as a middle-class consumer with an environmental conscience, and you can find all these great options. I sometimes wish I could have babies all over again because some of them looked so nice, but you know, unless you have access to online shopping, you're not going to find those suppliers. They're certainly not in, you know, they don't, as you say, they're not in Clicks or Skim, those nappies. So it's really then marketed at a very small segment of society that can access those solutions.
Great, thanks so much. I also think, you know, from our studies, you know, people, one, they can't find them, but that's probably also linked to slowing demand in reusables. So, you know, obviously with people shifting towards easier, more convenient, less work for themselves in terms of using disposables, shifting the markets and having access to reusables becomes less, with, you know, as demand shifts. So, and there's obviously among a lot of other reasons, including, I was also thinking online, a lot of the reusable products are online, and again, which serves as a particular kind of market, which, you know, unfortunately, then it's not an equal system and it's not fair, because there's not equal access to that. But it also just shows where the market shift is, which is again is a consumer driven, and costs associated with those is also another interesting dynamic and conversations to discuss. Fiona, I see your hand is up.
Yes, I just wanted to add to that. I found that there's a social economic element you've really got to take into account here, in that if you're looking at the cloth diapers as opposed to the bamboo ones, so the cloth diapers I found were really easy to find in shops like Pep, so, you know, less expensive shops. But if I was looking at things like the bamboo, those became more alternative shops. And I found the same thing with the menstrual products, is if you were looking for just the straight reusable pads, those were quite easy to find in your lower income shops and lower income areas, in things like Clicks and that, if they were in lower income areas. But if you were looking for things like your moon cups and things like that, that became more expensive in the more expensive alternative type shops. So that social economic difference of where you can actually find them is, I think, quite important if you are looking at, well, are people aware of them, are they using them, and do they have access to them?
Really interesting, thanks.
Great, thanks, Fiona. Giselle had a question. I'm just trying to get to it in the chat line, or more of a comment. Well, she had a question about the comparison in terms of impacts of degradability and disposal. Well, I suppose responsible disposal impacts between sanitary pads, for example, sanitary products, and obviously nappies. And I think it's been clear through the conversation that, you know, understanding those impacts and particles or chemical components of the biodegradability of those products is not clearly understood, and more research needs to be put on, needs to be done on that. So I think that question, unless Pippa, you want to add to that, but I think, it's clear that actually we do need to understand how these things degrade and the compound impacts of these products in terms of poor waste management in rural areas specifically, in a lot of African countries, I suppose. We certainly see that in our project areas, that illegal waste dumping of or poor waste disposal of nappies is a major problem. And that leads itself to the question of, if you classify disposable products or these absorbent products as general waste, for example, if you are disposing of it in a responsible way, yes, it is a general waste product. But if it is being dumped because it's not being removed, for example, then the toxicity of that in our watercourses and on terrestrial and those impacts on our biodiversity and people, that then brings the question, does it not become toxic then, in terms of a health and environmental health sense? So there's a whole lot of discussions and possible research that can support that discussion to inform policy, especially in South Africa, on how we can actually change or reclassify or our disposable products in terms of that context and that frame, so we can perhaps look at a better waste management system, at a municipal level or a government level going forward. Hugh?
Yes, just on that. That is an extremely important what we've found in our research, because the municipality is very reluctant to engage with us. Possibly because we were coming from a research angle, not strictly as a pilot, but finally, after long research, there's only one service provider who deals with accumulated nappy diaper waste, whether it's old age homes or creches. So because the highly rigorous standards that the Department of Health requires to be met to have this material collected and transported is a real barrier to, shall we say, democratizing the better management of disposables. So, but the Western Cape government, their policy position paper, which I've finally found, does say depends on an agreement between a municipality and a generator of accumulated nappy waste mass. They can negotiate between themselves how they dispose of it. If the municipality has the capacity to deal with it, they can make an arrangement. But it's so I just wanted to point out that they default to precautionary principle and therefore into healthcare risk waste, which means meeting Department of Health standards, which is onerous and expensive. So I thought I'd just make that clear that is but it does appear that the Department of Environment and nationally is starting to be aware of these issues around municipal hesitance to even deal with accumulated nappy waste. So, but I think the doors are kind of and the ears and the actions are hopefully opening.
Yeah, it's really encouraging to hear. There is, hopefully sanity and ways around these things.
Yes, I think there's a lot of discussion at a government level on nappy waste and management of nappy waste. So I think there's, perhaps it's time for maybe change would be coming soon. Let's hope anyway. Carly, you also were waiting, so you're up next, please.
Yeah, hi. Hugh, just a sidebar, we can chat separately about how we've gone about getting the proper licensing and things for transporting nappy waste in Kenya, if that's helpful to you. But my comment was actually about the marketing and getting the reusable nappies. I see it coming from two ends here. One thing that's unique about Mama Toto cloth diapers is that part of our social mission is to reach across all income levels. And so we work very hard to provide solutions across income levels. And we're one of the only diaper companies, reusable diaper companies in the world that actually has in their mission to reach across all income levels. Majority of cloth diaper manufacturers are just at that, they're targeting that high income person. And this is why you don't see it in any other places. It's not part of their mission. It's not what they're aiming to do. And I'm not going to lie, it's really hard, but there are ways to do it. I'm an international development professional in my background. And so that's where reaching this lower income customer and my expertise is really important through those partnerships and things that allow you to access that low income customer and designing a product and services for your low income customer, which is what cloth companies by other manufacturers are not done for. Our cloth diapers are maroon, they are not white. You ask me, why are they maroon? It's because it's the same color as dirt and so that people don't have to worry about getting it that bleach white, because if it's not bleach white, then they're seen as not taking care of their baby properly. And so it's a design issue and it's a mission issue from the manufacturers who are not trying to get to that low income customer. And also from a selling vendor standpoint, it's very difficult. I have these conversations frequently with supermarkets and other things. How do we get this product on your shelves? A reusable nappy is not a fast-moving consumer good. It is not in their interest to have our product on their shelf. And so we target our baby stores. And so we go to our high income, our middle income, and our lower income baby shops. And that's who we talk to. We've kind of given up on the big supermarkets. We're not a fast-moving consumer good. They're not going to take us on unless we have a huge market hold and a huge demand for it.
Yeah, that's such great to have your real insights, real world insights. Really nice. Thank you, Carly. I think just one thing that resonates really is, even in the Europe, I'm thinking of the context, policy context, it really is a lot around action saying they need basically policy that pushes reusables to equal footing because it's not going to happen, as you say, with markets. It actually needs strong policy to create a more equal footing between single-use and reusables. And I think, again, that's not specific to nappies. That's actually the wider reusable arguments.
Great, thank you so much. I think that we are, I hope I've got everyone's questions. If I've missed anyone's in the chat box, please let me know. We don't have any more hands up. But I think overall, what's really key for both your presentations in terms of, the key sort of nexus points of change is in policy through manufacturing and production guidelines and standards, which Belinda actually put up quite nicely in the chat. And there's quite a lot of opportunity around affecting efficient and effective waste management of disposables. And then obviously there's a massive drive in terms of consumer behavior and an education program or drive around that to bring about change in terms of choice, in terms of management of those choice or those chosen products. So, I mean, it's very insightful. And these are the sort of things that this research needs to inform, because we have to be able to find out what are these nexus points in terms of bringing about change. And that's what's really important. I think overall, in terms of the disposable waste, based on the research that I've looked at and obviously through the One Health Forum and a whole lot of other specialists in this field, is that it's not a problem that we can ignore much longer. It's causing masses of impact on our air and water quality, and there's a change is definitely needed. And obviously through the production, we can meet probably quite a lot of targets if we reduce energy and water consumption and reduce pollution and through those processes to reduce those impacts through manufacturing and production. So I think there's opportunity around that. And although quite daunting, I think, especially in the municipalities, Hugh, we find the same problems that municipalities are avoiding it because I think they're as much at a loss as everyone else. Without available resources to effectively manage waste, and that means money in terms of equipment to take away that waste. Often with our areas, one of the biggest problems is that the volume and the weight of the nappies is so big that small contractors can't afford to take them away because it costs too much and reduces their ability to take on the general waste which they consider general waste. So often the nappies are left behind. And, that's again, unfortunately, we have to understand the limitations of resource availability and capacity from the municipal level for this massive growing demand with our growing population. So there's lots of real problems and issues, but great opportunities in terms of bringing about change, I think. And I do these discussions. The reasons why we've put these webinars together is to create more understanding around it and appreciation for the problem and opportunities for change. We will be having more webinars. As Rini said in the chat, we want to hold one around policy. We're hoping to have one Nikki will be running. And I think, Nikki, there might be opportunity to link with Carly West, who's got quite a lot of knowledge around reusables, because we want to put in the final one, a story of change, because it's not just all about doom and gloom and, in terms of impacts, but the opportunities as well as, what is actually happening on the ground, that they're showing change, like reusable nappies or recycling systems or educational programs, that it is driving change in behavior. So I think that those stories of change will be one to consider. I don't know if there's any comments, like closing comments, of something that really stood out for you in terms of a takeaway message. If there's anyone in the group that just wants to either put in the chat or just in like 2 words, if you want to show a sense of appreciation of the knowledge that we've gained through this webinar.
I just want to say thank you to Pippa and Takunda, because actually you set a whole discussion for 2 hours.
Well, thank you for having me. It was really interesting, and it's great. I'm really encouraged to hear. I just see the theory, so it's been super nice for me as well to hear all this practice of things really moving forward. So it's really great. So thank you.
I agree with Pippa. It was very interesting to hear what people are doing out there and what real problems they're facing, because then it gives us practical ideas to try and solve.
Great, yes, and well then, thank you on that note, and thank you for everyone who participated. We had responses for over 100 people in the end. We got to about 48, 50 people in the group, which is still really, really great. Very insightful. And Pippa and Takunda, I invite you to join the One Health Forum as well. You might enjoy some of the discussions around that. And please diarise the 6th to the 8th of November, where we would like to host the first sort of One Health Forum conference, where we want to bring research on this topic and look at creating dialogue towards change within that conference. So that will be hosted this year, and I'll keep everyone updated with that, and we will certainly share the flyer again for the next webinar, which will be hosted next month. But thank you so much. It was really so insightful and so educational. So thank you very much, Pippa and Takunda, for your time. Thank you. Great. And on that note, yes, we're closing our first webinar session. And have a great day, everyone, and enjoy the long weekend.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.